Buenas tardes. Good afternoon and
Good
welcome.
afternoon.
I hope most of you know we are conducting today's event in Spanish, and I'll say more in a few minutes about why that is. But I wanted to take a second to make sure that everyone who wants to listen to the live interpretation in English can do so by clicking interpretation at the bottom of your Zoom window and choosing English, and look to the chat in a few seconds for instructions on how to submit questions in either Spanish or English. Dicho eso, bienvenidos todos.
Having said that, welcome you all. I'm Alberto Medina, and I am the communications team lead at Tisch College Center for Information and Research on Civic Learning and Engagement Circle. It is a pleasure and a privilege to be the moderator of this civic lunch that has been titled The Oldest Colony in the World, Perspectives on the Political Future of Puerto Rico, and to have as distinguished guest the author and journalist Ed Morales and the expert on human rights and lawyer Annette Martínez Orabona. Before starting, I would like to thank my colleagues at Tisch College, especially Jess Burns, Jen McAndrew, and Shine Lee Daly, for all their efforts to coordinate this event. I also want to thank our co-sponsors, the Political Sciences Department and the Department of Studies on Race, Colonialism, and Diaspora at Tufts University and Jumbo Vote, and the alumni engagement group. I also want to thank the Puerto Rican Students Association at Tufts. This is a new students group that is celebrating the Puerto Rican culture, aims at creating community and holding events on topics of interest for Puerto Rico. Their next event will be October the 27th at 6 p.m. at the Tufts Latinx Center. They will hold a discussion on the electrical power system and privatization in Puerto Rico. So I invite all students who want to learn more about Puerto Rico to participate in this conversation. By way of introduction, I would like to say a few words about why we have selected this topic, the status of Puerto Rico, and why this is of interest not only for Puerto Ricans as myself, but for everyone. Over the years, and with reason to be like that, the United States citizens have been concerned about the attacks on the democracy of the United States, and there have been efforts to make voting difficult for certain communities. In Puerto Rico, there are more than 3 million people who cannot vote for the president or for Congress people who have political power over them, and they don't have a number of democratic rights as a state or as a sovereign country. Over the last few years, there has also been an emphasis on racial justice and on understanding and rectifying how the United States has treated different minority groups throughout its history. In Puerto Rico, of course, almost all inhabitants are Latin, and this has a lot to do with the political inferiority regime that we have been subject to in the past and that still prevails today. In the United States, we also see the desire of decolonizing many aspects of public life. A lot is being said about decolonizing academic curricula, decolonizing arts, literature, but in the meantime, Puerto Rico, for all practical purposes, is still a colony of the United States that is still waiting for a literal and not a metaphorical decolonization. At Tisch College, we believe and we promote that all individuals, including students and other members of our university community, have the responsibility of taking action on issues relating to social justice, racial justice, political justice, and democratic justice. If Puerto Rico must be fully a part of the United States or not, that is something that we are going to discuss. But for the time being, Puerto Rico belongs to the United States, and this implies that this civic responsibility of all Americans should also be extended to Puerto Rico. Two last points before introducing our guest speakers. The first one, we do not intend here to have a fully representative panel of all the status alternatives for Puerto Rico. I hope that if we cannot discuss certain arguments or certain positions, can you feel encouraged to read more and to listen to other voices. Secondly, as I said initially, we decided to have this event in Spanish. Obviously, Puerto Rico is a country that mainly speaks Spanish. According to the census, more than 75% of Puerto Rico residents say that they don't speak English well. Given this reality, we consider it important that if we are going to have a conversation about the future of Puerto Rico, we should do that in the language that all Puerto Ricans can understand. So I thank our excellent interpreters and everyone for helping us conduct this event that is truly bilingual. Now, I would like to briefly introduce our guests to start with the conversation. Ed Morales is a journalist who has written for The Nation, The New York Times, The Washington Post, Rolling Stone, The Guardian, CNN, among others. He's the author of several books, including Living in Spanglish and Latinx, the new force in the American culture that has been in the short list for the Nayef Al-Rodan Award for Global Cultural Understanding given by the British Academy in London. His most recent book and most relevant for our conversation is Fantasyland, Colonialism, Exploitation and Betrayal to Puerto Rico. He also wrote and directed House Barrio, a documentary on gentrification in East Harlem. And he's currently an instructor, a lecturer at the Center for the Study of Ethnicity and Race at Columbia University and from the Graduate School of Journalism at CUNY. Our second guest speaker is Annette Martínez Orabona. She's an activist and a lawyer specializing in international human rights. Her work focuses on supporting vulnerable communities for them to improve their social, economic, and environmental environment. Annette is the executive director of the Caribbean Institute of Human Rights and the director of the Human Rights Clinic at the Inter-American University of Puerto Rico, where she's also a lecturer. In the past, she served as president of the board of directors of Amnesty International in Puerto Rico. She has coordinated testimony in the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights and for special procedures of the Council of Human Rights of the United Nations after the Hurricane Maria. And she has recently participated in hearings at the US Congress on the status of Puerto Rico. In the past, she also worked as a lawyer at the Center for Justice and International Rights, international law, where she dealt with cases of torture, disappearances, and individual rights of detainees at Guantanamo. She graduated from the School of Law of the Inter-American University of Puerto Rico, and she's also an alumni of the Fletcher School in Tufts University, where she has a master's degree on international public law. Thank you both for being with us. And Annette, welcome again to Tufts, although virtually this time. I would like to start with a question for both of you. We have the Wikipedia version of the history of the relationship between Puerto Rico and the United States. It goes like this. United States invaded and took over Puerto Rico in 1898 as part of the Spanish-American War. In 1917, Puerto Ricans were granted American citizenship. In 1948, for the first time, Puerto Ricans were allowed to hold elections instead of having a governor imposed directly from Washington, D.C. And in 1952, the Congress allowed Puerto Rico to have its own constitution and to come up with a new status, the so-called free associated state, which could be a happy medium between statehood and independence as a sovereign country. And for the last 70 years, Puerto Ricans have been divided. Many of them want to continue with the status quo. Many of them want Puerto Rico to be a state of the union, and a minority group wants independence. But here we are, nothing has happened. As I said, that is the Wikipedia version. Annette, especially from the legal and governmental standpoint, What are we missing in this version? What is important to understand about the nature of the relationship between the United States and Puerto Rico? Greetings to you, Alberto, and to all the people who have joined us today. Let me begin by thanking Tisch College and Tufts University for giving me this opportunity to be here with you today. It is always a pleasure for me to come back to the university. So, hello to everyone. That definition that you see in Wikipedia, as many other things that you read in Wikipedia, is quite incorrect, although it might be true from a certain point of view. Puerto Rico was invaded by the United States, but the rest is not accurate. This version of Wikipedia, well, there are actually books written about this, but I need to say the following. This version doesn't say that actually here we are talking about occupation, a continued ongoing occupation by an empire on a territory. It doesn't refer to the exploitation of resources in Puerto Rico. It doesn't speak about imposition of laws that do not favor the interests of Puerto Rico, of the territory, legislation that favors the economic interests of the United States. It doesn't refer to the environmental pollution that resulted from experiments in the military. It doesn't speak about mass displacement caused by this relationship and the occupation in the territory. It speaks about an idea of citizenship that has to be corrected. We are not talking about an American citizenship that was granted, it was imposed. No one in Puerto Rico had the opportunity to decide on that citizenship, and it doesn't qualify the citizenship for Puerto Ricans. So in that version of Wikipedia, there is no reference to the differences, the statutory differences that we have here vis-a-vis what happens with residents in the United States. And it speaks about a false status. Actually, Puerto Rico has never changed its status. It has never stopped being an occupied territory. The name did change. A new name was invented to describe this relationship. And the United States presented a new name with an internal structure that actually did not mean true changes in its relationship with the United States. So with this status, there is a reinforcement of that occupation of the United States in the Puerto Rican territory. It refers to a constitution that was drafted in the 1950s. However, it doesn't say that that constitution was amended, manipulated by other people, that significant clauses that were important for Puerto Ricans were deleted from that constitution. So we ended up having a document that was actually created by the United States. This, among many other things. So that definition lacks that definition, as I was saying, lacks accuracy. So this is what I can say by now.
Thank you, Annette. Ed, what else should we understand in terms of this relationship between Puerto Rico and the US, not only from the legal perspective, but also from the sociocultural perspective? Thank you very much for the invitation to speak to you this afternoon. I am very proud to be part of this renowned panel. In relation to the Wikipedia article, forcing the use of English in education, for example, the fact that there were no governors of Puerto Rican origin until 1948 that the agriculture of Puerto Rico transformed itself, varying products, even coffee and sugar production. That production was controlled by an American company. And also, the movements in favor of independence were repressed through the story that everybody knows, and with the imprisonment of the members, some members of the Nationalist Party. So in the middle of this context, that meets this context, we cannot talk about the competition between three parties as something that happens in a democratic country. It doesn't mention, as Annette also said, the creation of a free associated state has not changed the fact that Puerto Rico is under the power of Congress, the plenary powers issue. So the US and its alleged autonomy was more limited than it seemed. So for me, this illusion of democracy in Puerto Rico is the basis of my book, Fantasy Island. For me, this is the most important fantasy. Thank you, Ed. And for many years, the perception in Puerto Rico was, and for many still is, that this status quo is the best of both worlds. Puerto Rico has control on its local matters, as people think, and it also receives many federal funds and other support and aid from the US. So I believe that in an unconscious manner, this is what many think in the US. That's why they don't necessarily believe this is a problem that must be solved. So Annette, well, you've talked about this already, but what is the main problem with this vision that the status is the best of the world, of the two worlds? Well, Alberto, the reality is that perhaps at some point in our past history, some Puerto Ricans maybe believed the story that this was the best of the two worlds. And this also accounts for the fact that I was born and raised in a colony. My parents were born and raised in a colony. My grandparents were born and raised in a colony. And my children are being raised in a colony. So we do not know anything different from this. So Puerto Ricans have always been imposed this vision, and we have always been told that, in fact, this is what we have, the best of the two worlds, having this relationship with the US, using one way or other possibility of having, let's say, a better status, a better economic position, so on and so forth. However, today, nobody believes that story anymore. It's impossible to maintain that lie when today we are living the worst time, the worst period, I would say, of our relationship with the US, and the worst economic situation, the worst situation in terms of healthcare, the worst situation in any sense of the word. So the access to public services is a problem. The quality of life is very deteriorated. More than half of our population lives under the poverty line. And when I say this, I mean this is a much lower poverty line than the poverty level of the poorest state in the US. So nobody can say this is the best of both worlds. So even that view, that vision that people wanted to sell to us is no longer sustained. So it is clearer today than what it was for my grandparents that bought the idea of this change of status and that the US went to the UN and appeared before the UN saying that we had made an autonomous exercise. However, today, the US Supreme Court, the executive branch in the US itself, recognized that there was no such change. So not even that illusion that we had, that we were able to exercise our autonomy, not even that idea can be can prevail. So this is what I have to say about this division of Puerto Rico in its current status. That's at a time they wanted to sell this idea to us that this was the best of both worlds. This view has changed, and I think that we are clearer now that we need a change of view, and that finally a true autonomous exercise of self-determination can exist. Ed, your book speaks about these topics in the past years, the past decades, as you mentioned, and as Annette also said. And so you try to make and draw a direct line between these problems and the status, and you even accuse the US of exploitation and treason. So how is it so? Could you explain this connection between these problems that Puerto Rico is going through and its relationship with the US? Well, first of all, I would like to say that this relationship with the United States has given us some benefits. The possibility of traveling with the American passport and having the citizenship, which is only effective as long as we live in the US. However, that entailed a huge cost that affects us as a people, as a nation, psychologically. And it is related and it is located at the root, at the core of the development of Puerto Rico and how hard it is to grow economically. So the Puerto Rican economy as a colony has no chances of sustaining itself as long as we don't have growth and accumulation in the country. Before the creation of the free trade agreement, the United States created a free trade zone in Puerto Rico where all those conditions favored American companies. And most of the profit would go to those companies as well. So the treason that in English actually is betrayal more than treason is the same betrayal that the United States has perpetrated against all its colonies abroad and also in the country. The Puerto Rican nation exists as an internal colony of the US, and there is the desire for autonomy as was defined under the free associated state notion, where there is no freedom and there is subrogation and subjugation. And this is also reflected in the second-class citizenship that was given to Puerto Ricans. And as I said before, we are not protected under the Constitution because the Congress can use unconstitutional methods. And much has been said about the lack of representation in Congress and also for the president of the US, but not much has been spoken about the way the Congress has power on the matters of Puerto Rico. And this is betrayal because we assume that Congress should be the cradle of democracy in the most advanced democracy in the world. So having established some of these problems with the current relationship and the status quo, why don't we talk about some of the options to solve it, mainly statehood or independence? Although people talk about free association as well, so this would be a sort of sovereignty with a treaty with the United
que
States.
es la
So
opción.
let's talk about statehood first. This is the option that is spoken more and more supported in Puerto Rico. I imagine that for many, the benefits of statehood are relatively clear. There would be a political representation and equity, at least in theory, and parity in many laws, federal funds, government programs that currently are inconsistently applied in Puerto Rico. But I am interested in your stances regarding the disadvantages. Annette, recently at the Congress, you stated in the case of integration or annexation to the US, international law is very skeptical about that option. So what do you mean by that? Yes, of course. I was making reference during that testimony before Congress to the international law, the applicable law about the right to self-determination of the people. So ultimately, this is the process to follow in order to solve the situation in Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico is a nation with its own identity, territory, its own language, its own idiosyncrasy. And at international level, there is no doubt that Puerto Rico has a collective right, fundamental right to decide what type of political relationship, if any, it wants to have with the US. Now, the processes being defined under UN resolutions, Article 73 of the treaty of this organization, and also in other instruments, establish that there are three viable alternatives for a nation to exercise its right to self-determination. For independence, there is the possibility of having some sort of relationship from independence, which would be free association. And also the integration with another state. A distinction should be made between integration and annexation. Annexation as such is prohibited in international law. Annexation means when a country that occupies another nation and takes increasingly more control on that area to such an extent that it finally acquires it, annexes it, makes it of its own. However, integration is different. According to international law, integration takes place based on the sovereign decision of two nations, sovereign nations on equals, based on equals. They decide that the best political future is to make one out of two, that the exercise stems from the autonomous sovereign power without any external intervention of the occupying nation. So my presentation was intended to explain that the international process, the UN resolutions and mechanisms that define the decolonizing process actually favor independence. And this is the case because the main criterion is based on the fact that the people has the right, and the only solution that doesn't require the consensus of the other state is independence. So that's when the people can decide to become independent. However, integration under international law imposes on the occupying state some obligations, and those obligations are very imperative. the state that occupies is responsible for developing the social, economic growth of the occupied land, with the notion that it has enough independence and criteria to decide that it really wishes to integrate itself. So if the process takes place like this, of course, through elections, valid plebiscites, transparent mechanisms, then with the support of UN observers, so on and so forth, I'm talking about an international process, not an internal process. So this is what I meant. And in the case of Puerto Rico, currently there are no conditions for Puerto Ricans to be able to determine under this process, under those criteria, according to international law, can decide on integrating through a valid and legitimate manner. Because the truth is that right now, we have a territory that is heavily dependent on the occupying state. And that dependence has been intentional and has not changed over time. Quite the contrary, it has become bigger and bigger, particularly with this imposition of the Fiscal Control Board that decides on each and every action in government terms and the policies in Puerto Rico.
Thank you, Annette. Ed, there are many arguments against statehood that are about, as you well said, and Annette also said, about the identity and culture of Puerto Ricans, the fact that they have a different nationality and the fear of losing that. Others say that's wrong, that in the US, the Latino cultures survive and thrive. You've written a lot about Puerto Rico and the Latino culture and identity in the United States. So what do you think of those arguments, and what can you tell us about statehood from the point of view of identity and culture? Well, I think it is fabulous to have this hybrid culture in the United States based on cultures coming from Latin America, but those cultures are a variation of the original cultures. And what we see is that there is a threat against the Puerto Rican identity that comes hand in hand with statehood. So perhaps this can have an elimination effect on the original culture. For instance, Mexico and Colombia are not considered for statehood. So we will always have in the United States a culture that mixes the Colombian and Mexican culture with our own culture in the United States. We speak Spanglish, we use different terms and different ways of expression. But those countries still exist, and they are not going to be annexed to the United States, as our colleague Annette has said. Although Puerto Rico does not have sovereignty, people still think that it is a nation, and this would be threatened with this idea of statehood. Since I was a young child, my father would teach me that Puerto Rico was a country, that Puerto Rico is a territory. Even those that favor statehood think about Puerto Rico as a nation. The truth is that the whole world is under the threat of Americanization through global capitalism. But look what happened in Hawaii. The traditional culture has been significantly suppressed. And this is something that Puerto Ricans need to take seriously. I don't know if we can talk about the pure culture here, but what we see in Puerto Rico right now, in the old San Juan, we see there as an important cultural center. In San Juan, the cultural center is also under threat of austerity. So this puts the whole idea of the Puerto Rican identity in danger. Thank you. So now let's look at the other side of the coin. Let's talk about independence. For some, this means national liberation and the end of colonialism. For others, it means that a place like this will be rife with poverty and socioeconomic vulnerability and would separate itself from the richest and most powerful country in the world with a high level of dependence. So this question is for either or both of you, because I know it's a tough one. Is independence economically and politically viable in the short or in the long term? What would have to happen for it to be viable? Somebody from the audience is asking us whether we need to ask for any repair measures from the United States, what would happen with government debt. So I'm leaving you with all these questions. Well, let me say, Alberto, that independence in Puerto Rico, wherever you look for the different options for the status of Puerto Rico, you find that there are only a few people who want independence for Puerto Rico. It seems that nobody wants Puerto Rico to become independent, and that is false in the first place. But it is not only false, we also need to understand the historical background of our relationship with the United States in order to understand why a group of people and organizations have supported independence and now seem to be shrinking. And this has to do precisely with the US policies imposed on Puerto Rico, the brutal persecution that we have seen over the years against any individual or group who would dare even consider the possibility of independence as something viable. So, if I dare saying that is possible, I'm exposing myself to some risk. We need to understand that in Puerto Rico, the groups that advocate independence, which are quite isolated because we are not talking about a homogeneous group, but they have in common this ideal of independence, have been incarcerated. They have been tortured. They have been taken away their professional and career development opportunities. There are some people who have lost most of their productive years because they have been detained, they have been incarcerated. So it is not very easy just to dare to think about the possibility of independence in Puerto Rico. This idea that Ed mentioned, this law that was passed was one that banned Puerto Ricans even to raise their own flag. And I'm proud of the age that I am now, but I remember that when I was a child, it would create a whole discussion in the family, this idea of trying to raise our own flag. And we didn't have that law. So when we talk about independence, this is a painful issue for us. And whoever dares to mention this is running a risk. But of course, it is possible to have an independent Puerto Rico. Of course, we have been led to think that that is not possible. However, that is possible, but they are still stepping on us. So we still feel the pressure. This is perhaps the first time that the United States has to deal with the negotiation of its future with other territories. The US Congress has started bilateral negotiations with territories, with the Marshall Islands, with the Palau Islands, and even today they are holding negotiations because they have a free association agreement. And I'm not saying that this is just the only resource that we have left. What I'm saying is that this is not sophisticated idea for the United States. This is not something alien to the United States. The United States is used to holding negotiations and may decide unilaterally to give something in exchange. And we have seen this in Congress. Why is it that we cannot have that on our side? This is what should happen, because we have had an occupied territory for more than 120 years with constant pollution, with terrible displacement. Today, we still see some areas that are contaminated and that have not been rehabilitated. We still don't have exact information on the amount of the pollution caused by the US Navy. Of all the bombardments they caused over the years. So this is a fully contaminated territory. This is just one of many other things that we need to consider. So we cannot be independent. Perhaps this is something that in my case, I don't feel afraid anymore of saying that. But I know that this is a difficult issue. I do think that Puerto Rico deserves to have the option, and the US has the obligation to sit at the negotiation table and to negotiate on an equal footing and to take all the necessary repair measures for all the time that it has occupied the territory in Puerto Rico. It is difficult to continue after such strong statements by Annette, but which should be the conditions for the independence in Puerto Rico? Well, I think that when we talk about independence, we can focus also our arguments on racial discrimination, because in the case of Puerto Rico was never accepted as a member on the basis of racist arguments. In the insular cases, there is one that is quite popular that showed that Puerto Ricans belong but are not part of the United States. And that was a decision made by some judges who ruled over the segregation of the American citizenship between the black and the white parts of the population. So here we can also consider how the debt built up. So we need to work from that basis in order to see what has happened over the last 120 years. So 50 or 70 years ago, we could avoid that, but now we need to do that. We need to be careful because we shouldn't use the same arguments that African Americans are using, because there is also a group that is in Puerto Rico that is not being discriminated against. And they took advantage of that relationship. So we have to be careful. When we talk about independence, we see some separations that are not for the benefit of some privileged groups in Puerto Rico. Okay, thank you. I'm going to ask the last question, and I will try also to take some of the questions from the audience coming through the Q&A part. And I invite participants to ask more questions.
Que le debe importar a todos
I
los.
started saying that this is a matter that should be of importance to everyone. However, according to my experience and probably yours as well, many people think that it is not appropriate for Americans to speak about this topic or support either of the options. And we've also seen recently some Democrats who said that they want the statehood for Puerto Rico. However, their main motivation is to balance out the Senate. The Puerto Rican senators would be Democrats, so that's why they follow that line. So Annette, regardless of the fact that Americans want to get involved or not, as you said, this is a process where Congress has power, has a responsibility, and there are two bills, status bills in Congress right now. Unfortunately, they don't have high chances. However, if things go like that, we are going to go back to a limbo on this matter. So if this happens, you as a Puerto Rican in the island, what would you like to see and listen from the US on this matter? I believe that we should make a distinction on some key concepts that apply to Puerto Rico and are being misused with good intentions, but misused in the discussions on Puerto Rico in the US. First, that this is a matter of the rights of minorities in the US. So we should have the right to vote for president, to have representatives as any other American citizen. And it should be clearly made that the matters of Puerto Rico is not a matter of a minority as part of the American people. Puerto Rico is a matter related to the self-determination of an independent and autonomous people with its own identity, territory, and idiosyncrasy that was occupied. So that's a different thing. I am very much concerned and worried because there is this trend to make reference to the situation of Puerto Rico as a situation of a minority within the American people, without making the distinction that Puerto Rico is a people in itself, a nation in itself, with a right to self-determination. That's for starters. And second, these two status bills are a very good example that the situation has not been solved yet. As we said before, some people think that the situation is over. However, the situation of Puerto Rico has never been solved. And the fact that we see these two bills in Congress evidences that there is a recognition and an acknowledgement that this is a matter to be addressed. This is not the first time that a bill is submitted. However, the bill by Nidia Velázquez and Alexander Cortez is different from the bills presented in the past because this bill in particular talks about the right to self-determination and recognizes the right of Puerto Rico as a nation and also identifies the three internationally legitimate and viable alternatives for an adequate solution to the colony. So there is a recognition that we have a colonial relationship in the first place. There have been some changes in the way how this matter is being dealt with. And the other bill is a bill that has many problems and is based on an alleged Puerto Rican mandate in a plebiscite conducted in the last general elections in Puerto Rico in the middle of the pandemic that did not meet the necessary requirements for Puerto Rican residents to vote in an informed manner about the Puerto Rican status. But that's a different story. But this is what I can share with you about these two bills. We have a question from several students, including Ms. Infanta, who is one of the leaders in Tufts. What is the role of the Puerto Rican diaspora, Puerto Ricans like you, like me, and some students here at Tufts? Because some people believe that this should only apply to Puerto Rican residents who must participate in these debates and decisions. But in your opinion, what is the role of the diaspora? Well, the diaspora has the right to issue comments on the situation and to show solidarity with the Puerto Ricans. And the diaspora, in my case, and in many cases, it's those of us who could not stay in Puerto Rico due to economic reasons. And we suffered a lot, maybe at the same level as those who stayed in the country. Now, the most important role is to make pressure on the US politicians to make decisions, and that will always help Puerto Ricans. They should be in favor of auditing the debt, canceling the debt, and most important, refuse an advocate a plan, an economic plan in Puerto Rico where the island could grow and create a good basis of wealth. So that should be the reason for favoring it. The corruption that we have, this bad governance that we have, stems from the fact that Puerto Rico does not have a self-sustaining economy. So for me, any state option or any status option should be supported by these factors. In that manner, Puerto Rico will be able to recover the wealth that it lost in the colonial times and now the neo-colonial time. However, we should sit at the table to discuss these things, but always respecting the decision of the Puerto Rican residents, those who live in Puerto Rico, because they are the ones to determine the future. Good. And to conclude with a last question, Ed, you mentioned the importance of respecting what Puerto Ricans want. We had a plebiscite in 2020, as Annette mentioned, and well, much can be discussed about the validity of the plebiscite and the quality obtained 53% of the votes. And Congress, nevertheless, seems to ignore the result of the plebiscite. But what should we think about that the Puerto Rican people expressed itself about its intentions for the political future, regardless of how problematic that expression could be. And on the other hand, the Congress seems to stand quiet, do nothing about it. I think it is very hard to take seriously a plebiscite that was manipulated by a party. Maybe if we had such a resolution, something written only by the Republicans or by the Democrats, nobody will take it seriously. And also, right now, due to the imposition of the fiscal board, the Popular Party has many problems because the free trade status is a fake, it's a false notion. So what is it based on? What is this party based on? So that takes votes out of that option. the option of a free associated state is very hard to justify or to explain, and all the proposals and the possibility of dealing with other nations, that could also be a breach, a violation of the American Constitution. I know that there are pros and cons, but for me, the entire plebiscite process, to be honest, was related to collecting donations but for political parties and affecting the election in Florida, for instance. Annette, you have the last word, 30 seconds. Thank you, Alberto. I agree with Ed. We felt and experienced it very closely, this attempt of gaining more votes of the Puerto Ricans that had escaped the hurricane to the US. And that was a very terrible management for people who were in a situation of despair. And it was not the first time that Puerto Ricans were used as a piece of a puzzle in the political game. So I think it is terrible that they tried to frame our situation in a way that it would only be good to gain more votes for one party or for another. So the situation of Puerto Rico requires the US to assume its obligation and its responsibility to take charge of repairing the situation created by the US, the exploitation of our resources. However, we see the opposite. We see more privatizations of public services, a terrible displacement of our population. So we can't speak or we can't say that this is a legitimate process, a situation among equals, that this is just the rights of minorities in Puerto Rico. It's not as simple. Yes, and we didn't have time to touch upon the most recent problems that we are seeing these days in Puerto Rico. But I hope this is the first of many future conversations. Unfortunately, we are running out of time. Thank you, Annette. Thank you, Ed. Thanks to our sponsors very much. Thanks to everyone for participating in this conversation. And I want to invite you to keep on reading our material, discussing about Puerto Rico, because as Annette and Ed said very well, that this is a responsibility of the United States and of American citizens. And I invite you to stay tuned to the next events of Tisch College for our next events and conversations. Thank you very much. Have a great evening. Thank you. Bye-bye.